I'm very pleased to open this session of the conference dealing with Israeli statehood and international actors. I shall not be long. Suffice it to say that the establishment of Israel statehood has for a long time been studied from an exclusive single national angle, notably the Israeli perspective of the somewhat miraculous and heroic events of the 47-48 period, and the Palestinian view of these events culminating in their Nakba. The last 2 decades witnessed extensive global historical research which have not only facilitated new understanding of the two, but shedded much light on the role played by other involved: Britain, the United States, the USSR, France, Italy, and a couple of less-known others. Thus, we are now fully aware of the fact, for example, that far from being interested in returning to Palestine following the UN November 47 resolution, the British were definitely working to minimize the losses involved in departing from Palestine. We are equally aware of the agonizing gap between the Palestinian radical platform and their actual political and military abilities. The initial lack of proper military planning for war on the Jewish side and the international setting which facilitated its relatively speedy rearmament from mid-47 until 48. Likewise, we have been enlightened on the mechanism of policymaking on the Soviet side, leading to the sensational Gromyko Declaration in April 1947, supporting the creation of 2 states in Palestine. And of course, there is the reasons for the March 48 apparent withdrawal of American support for the establishment of the Jewish state. 4 distinguished scholars who are with us on the rostrum are going to enlighten us, not more than 20 minutes please, on these and other topics. I shall start with the one to my right, Professor Władysław Zubok from George Washington University, a well-known Sovietologist whose book Inside the Kremlin Cold War from Stalin to Khrushchev not only is in our required reading in the Department of International Relations, but it had won the Lionel Gelber Prize as the best English language book on international relations in 1996. His recent book, A Failed Empire, the Soviet Union in the Cold War, from Stalin to Gorbachev, is just out, and we look forward to reading this book. Professor Gabriel Scheffer, Professor Emeritus, this is new for me, Professor Emeritus, Political Science, the Hebrew University, well known to you. He's written extensively on ethnic politics, the politics of ethno-national diasporas, leadership, public policy and process of change in Israel, and of course lately on civil-military relation in Israel. His last book, one of his last, Diaspora Politics at Home and Abroad, was published by Cambridge University Press, and a forthcoming book of him on civil-military relation in Israel is to be published by Indiana University Press, is shortly to be there. I just want to say that not many of you are familiar with the fact that Gabi Scheffer has started his career as a specialist on Britain in Palestine in the 30s, and he kept up with the subject, although he switched to other fields, so he knows something about the topic, and he's going to share it with us, of course. Avraham Sela, to the right, is a specialist on contemporary Middle East society and politics, especially the case of the Palestinians. He has been Professor Avraham Sela is in the Department of International Relations on the regional Middle East politics, particularly inter-Arab and Arab-Israeli relations. His last book, The Palestinian Hamas Vision, Violence and Adjustment, was published by Columbia University Press. And of course, he is a well-known actor on Middle East actors. As a matter of fact, that was the topic of his PhD at the time, the Middle East and the approach of war in 1948. Lastly, last but not least, Professor Alon Kadish from the Department of History at the Hebrew University, has started his career as a specialist on British economic policy ages ago, if I may say. The Corn Law, the campaign for free trade in Britain in the early 19th century. Then he's found out that it's much easier to compete with the Israelis here, working on Israel, if I may, alone. And he became a leading specialist on the 48 war, a topic on which he published extensively. The last book in Hebrew, Israel's War of Independence Revisited, a 2-volume, very, very solid study on a new aspect of the 48 war. So, and he, of course, is going to elaborate on the Israeli perspective. So we've got here really 4 leading scholars, and I'm sure that they are going to enlighten us. Shall I ask Professor Zubok to take the rostrum, please?
Okay. Well, as I was listening to Professor Kirkendall, I was imagining how it was 30 years ago. I was still growing up in the Soviet Union, never dreamed of being allowed to travel outside the Iron Curtain. So here I am. My thanks and gratitude to all the hosts. And my task of limited enlightenment within 20 minutes is to talk about the Soviet factor. I would call it rather Stalin and Israel. We still have plenty of blank spots and many black holes, I would say, in the Soviet record, despite the archival revolution during the last 17 years. I would particularly like to read what telegrams Stalin was sending from his vacation on the Black Sea in the fall of 1947 to the Kremlin. In this correspondence, I'm sure we'll find many answers or maybe even many new questions. Unfortunately, we don't have it. We don't have the military records. We don't have the intelligence records. So what do we have? We have the publications, and quite interesting publications of documents from the foreign ministry that testifies to the development of Soviet policy towards the Palestine issue. And it looks like, to everybody's surprise, and particularly to the British and American surprise, since May 1947, Moscow, I would cautiously say Stalin, decided that the only way to recoup after the failures that the Soviet Union sustained in Turkey and Iran in 1945-46 would be to ally with the Zionist movement and support the establishment of an independent Jewish state. As we talk about transnational history, which sort of became another fashion today, but I sincerely believe we should go in this direction, it's absolutely mandatory to look at the Soviet angle of the story of the emergence of Israel. Without the Soviet angle, it's absolutely inconceivable to imagine how Israel could have emerged, at least in diplomatic ways, so successfully in 1948. When we look at the scale and various aspects of Soviet assistance to the Zionists, it's quite staggering, especially considering what happened then, especially considering what was happening already at that time inside the Soviet Union, that is, rising wave of anti-Semitism directed by the state, directed by the same Stalin. Well, it's a paradox how at the same time the Kremlin that was promoting and encouraging anti-Semitism within the Soviet Union and larger in its Eastern European empire was trying to ally with the Zionist movement. Well, we have to, as historians, we have to live with contradictions. Truman made anti-Semitic remarks, and yet now he's considered to be almost the godfather of Israel. So with Stalin, there are many more contradictions. I would say even if we get full records, historians will continue to debate what was going on the Soviet side, because we have at least 3 elements that complicate the picture for historians to imagine what was happening. First, ideological component, that is, the Soviet leaders and Stalin himself had believed in certain basic assumptions, and in the case of the Middle East, they believed that That was the area of potentially very intense contradictions between the leading imperialist powers, that is the United States and Great Britain, that should be exploited. They also believed that the Zionist movement was one of many movements of national liberation that should be supported by the Soviet Union as a matter of principle and used as a tool against the entire imperialist system, both to promote contradictions within that system and to weaken it by supporting the movements of liberation. So those ideological assumptions cannot be dismissed because they were real and they were very substantial. The traces of these assumptions can be found in all diplomatic papers that Moscow published before or since the collapse of the Soviet Union. The second factor that seems to contradict the impact of ideology is staggeringly cynical Soviet realism. Staggeringly cynical Soviet realism that bases on the idea that you can manipulate and you should manipulate everybody to promote Soviet interests. And this cynical realism, to an extent, almost blinded the Soviet leaders to other factors that existed. Not everybody is a cynic in the world. There's some idealists, and of course Stalin always thought of them as useful fools that could be manipulated. But in that case, as I show, some elements of, for instance, idealistic beliefs, or Truman's religious beliefs, that even American historians discounted for quite a while, came quite as a surprise for Stalin. And finally, of course, the final third factor that complicates historical analysis of the Soviet policies is Stalin himself, that despite many biographies and many revelations, including, Montefiore's huge biography, 2 books about young Stalin and Stalin the Tsar, the Court of the Red Tsar, still Stalin remains an enigmatic figure. So when you have all these 3 factors, it's not a surprise that this field will remain contested and will remain quite inconclusive for a lifetime, maybe. So decision-making on the Soviet side regarding the establishment of Israel is still murky. It's still, we don't have a sufficient amount of information. It's a big factor of silence, actually, on the Jews. I'm involved in a project where we're trying to put together all Stalin's conversations from 1944 until his death with foreign visitors. We already found over 200 conversations with all kinds of foreigners, representatives, diplomats, and so on and so forth. And when I just yesterday again tried to search for the word like Palestine, Israel, Jews, Jewish, I found only 3 or 4 times when Stalin used such words in conversations. In 1944, in October, when he spoke with Churchill, and Churchill said, we're trying to persuade Jews to move to Libya, but they resist. And so they discussed Jewish issue with Churchill in October 1944 with regard to the potential mandate in Libya. And then, of course, famously or infamously, in December 1952, Stalin was telling the Politburo that all Jews are nationalists, and who basically support. They expect Anglo-American capital to support them, and they're all intelligence agents of the Anglo-Saxon bloc. So what happened in between? What was really in Stalin's mind? We don't have direct evidence. We only have indirect evidence, unfortunately. But even that indirect evidence is very valuable, and from all of it we can find that actually in Stalin's and Molotov's mind, probably, and we can only guess, we can only speculate at that moment, they saw a good chance to dislodge Great Britain from Palestine and to compete with the United States for influence in that region. And the biggest element of this belief was their plan to support the establishment of an independent Jewish state. It's well known that in Soviet diplomatic correspondence they say we cannot be the first to propose an independent Jewish state. For tactical reasons, we suggest a joint Jewish-Arab state, but our position that really reflects our interests is an independent Jewish state. So what's behind it? We can so far only hypothesize and speculate, but with some evidence we can see that the Soviets had some assets. They had cultural assets, they had intelligence assets, and they hoped with the help of immigration of Jews from the countries under their influence, from Eastern European countries, to increase their assets in the Israeli society. They also clearly expected that the Soviet Union would be in a position of advantage since May 1947, and Gromyko unexpectedly caused a sensation by supporting the idea of an independent Jewish state, that the Soviet Union would be in that unique vantage point as the leading friend of the Israelis, of the Israeli state. Stalin's politics in the past demonstrate his success in manipulating and using national liberation movements, including in the region. He quite successfully created and supported the Kurdish nationalist movement in 1945-46 in Iran, in northern Iran, as well as the movement of Iranian Azeris. And only the fact that Great Britain and the United States acted jointly prevented the Soviet Union from getting its sphere of influence and its access to northern Iranian oil in 1946. So he could reasonably expect that in the case of the Jews, he would be equally successful. It's often said that Stalin somehow, foolishly maybe, underestimated the strong connection between the founders of Israel, between the Zionists in Palestine and American Jews. Not at all. The entire collection of available Soviet documents testify that was the worst case scenario they always had on their mind. It was despite that worst case scenario that the Kremlin master still decided to go on and play his gamble in Palestine. One of potentially interesting way to think about this problem is that Stalin did not expect the war between the Arabs and the Jews to end so decisively in favor of Israel. Indeed, nobody expected that. There's a shade of it in conversation between Soviet diplomat Malik and Moshe Sharett. I think it was August 1948 when Malik expressed great admiration and surprise at Jewish victory. If we imagine an alternative historical scenario, most likely to everybody in the world early in 1948, that the Jews would actually not be so decisively victorious, they would be weak, they would always need support from the outside. Then Stalin's scenario of having a Jewish state teetering on the brink of collapse all the time, badly needing Soviet support, sheds more light on what his expectations in the Middle East, in Palestine at least, were at the time. Indeed, there was of course, always in Stalin's mind, as other better researched cases show, there were always many chess games that he tried to play simultaneously. One should not look at his policies and Soviet policies in Palestine as a case separate from other issues that were evolving simultaneously. French historian Ricard, I think, very convincingly argued that the fact that the basic, most important factor that triggered the change of Soviet policy towards Palestine was the Truman Doctrine. One can also say that the Marshall Plan and the resistance to the Marshall Plan was another factor. At least that's what some Americans thought in conversation with the Jewish representative in New York. Dean Rusk was saying that Russians are seeking to recruit Jews around the world to derail the Marshall Plan. And it would have been a tremendous victory for Soviet foreign policy if Jewish interests would align with the Soviet Union. Well, the Soviet Union already did it, as we all know from history, in 1941-42, after Hitler attacked the Soviet Union. He appealed to the Jews around the world. So one can consider this was the second attempt by the Kremlin dictator to play the Jewish card. And then, of course, came those surprises. I already mentioned one, a surprising victory that Israel had in 1948. Another surprise, I might say, although this is based on extremely tenuous evidence, is Truman's decision to support Israel. Yes, of course, the United States and the Soviet Union moved on parallel tracks, competing using the example of Germany for the soul of Jewish people, as they had competed for the soul of Germans. But still, Stalin did not expect that Truman would do it so quickly, and the factor that might be considered in this case is Truman's Jewish beliefs. Although Stalin himself was kicked out of the seminary, I think he consistently dismissed the role of religious beliefs. He conceived himself as a realist. He was proud of his own cynical realism and rationality, but he never saw how people like Truman could act on his beliefs, not on other kinds of more materialistic interests. Well, what we see since May 1948, we see that still many Jews, including the founders of Israel, felt a considerable gratitude to the Soviet Union and to Stalin, Molotov, and other Soviet leaders for their role in the establishment of Israel. There are many interesting citations. It's just not only officially expressed by Golda Meirson when she came to Moscow as ambassador in 1948, but also in September 1949, Foreign Minister of Israel Moshe Sharett, born, of course, in Ukraine, in Kherson, wrote to Israel emissary in London, resisting his proposal to take sides in the Cold War, siding with the democratic West against the USSR. I quote from the document, "This would be blatant ingratitude towards the USSR and its allies, especially considering their inestimable political and practical assistance that provided for us during the decisive phase of our struggle for independence," and so on and so forth. So it's another thing that Stalin was Stalin, and he was probably the least likely person to capitalize on anybody's gratitude. He was known for squandering his capital everywhere in the world, and that was the case with Israel. There were some hopes that he could still use Israel as a pawn in his geopolitical game until 1950-51, but then, especially with the outbreak of the Korean War and the remarkable success of NATO, it was a waning, fading hope. So one can imagine his anger growing, and in a sense, although anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union was rising before, in 47, 48, in January 48, actor Michoels was assassinated, and at the end of 48, the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee was arrested and later killed, and so on and so forth. The final straw was his realization that Israel was unusable as a geopolitical asset. It was definitely allied with the other side, despite the wishes of such men as Sharett. So his transition to the opinion that I already quoted in December 1952, that all Jews are intelligence agents of British-American bloc, that conclusion unleashed the infamous Kremlin doctors' affairs, and as some historians believe, triggered preparation for a massive state-led Jewish pogrom in the Soviet Union that was aborted only by Stalin's death. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Zubok. I'm calling on Gabi Scheffer, please.
Thank you. Well, since the topic of Britain and Palestine and the establishment of Israel is a huge one, I've decided to focus today on President Truman's influence on the British Labour government policy vis-à-vis the Palestine problem during the 1945 to 1948 period. Until World War II, the British controlled quite effectively the Middle East, including Palestine. This was the case despite the fact that the British encountered challenges and difficulties in their relations with the Arabs in various countries, including Palestine, the Jews and the Zionists, and other European powers, especially the French, Italians, and the Germans. However, such challenges and threats were not critical. The Middle East was regarded, and it was effectively an integral and secure part of the British Empire. The gradual deterioration of the British hegemony in this region began a little bit prior and mostly during Second World War. During the latter stages of the war, the main challenges for Britain was generated by the United States and to a lesser extent also by the Soviet Union, which you were discussing and mentioning a minute ago. One of the issues, but by no means the most critical one, that motivated the United States to increase its involvement in the Middle East were the Holocaust and its consequences. I'm talking about the late stages of the Second World War. The growing tensions between Jews, Arabs, and British in Palestine, and the Jews and Palestinian Arabs' demand to establish their sovereign states in that country. Nevertheless, Britain and the United States tried to coordinate their strategy and tactics in the region in general and in Palestine in particular. Despite some disagreements, and there were disagreements, reasonable relations between Churchill and Roosevelt contributed to the temporary lack of evident major political clashes between the two powers concerning the situation in Palestine, and also Churchill's attitude toward the Palestinian issue were quite changing, and that decreased, I think, the tension between the United States and Britain concerning this issue during the Churchill-Roosevelt period. Quite naturally, the British continued to formulate and nurture their strategic plans for the future of the region during the post-war war period. The main idea was to gradually reorganize the entire region. One of the aspects of this plan was that of a greater Syria, within which the Palestinian issue would be solved. Therefore, as far as the Palestine question was concerned, the debate mainly among the British and American civilian bureaucrats and officers, and this was also mentioned in some of the previous talks here, was about each power's commitment to implement the Balfour Declaration. The Labour Party's victory in 1945 elections, Attlee's and Bevin's role in shaping British policies, the death of Roosevelt, and the beginning of Truman's presidency signaled changes in American and British position vis-à-vis the Palestine question. Initially, unlike Churchill's position during Roosevelt's presidency, Attlee and Bevin's government basic position was that Britain alone should be in charge of any solution of the Palestine problem. They firmly supported the view that Palestine should become a binational state for both the Jews and Palestinians. I'm using binational state, to fit the current jargon. However, a major change in the British government position began as a reaction to President Truman's call in August 1945 for the immediate immigration of 100,000 displaced Jews to Palestine. On various occasions, Bevin remarked that the issue of the Jewish refugees and Truman's general and Truman's support for this immigration would cause also a change in British-American cooperation and relations. In any case, the British government rejected Truman's call for allowing the immigration to Palestine of the 100,000 displaced persons. Since the senior British politicians understood that the Americans would become even more closely involved in the developments in the Middle East in general and in Palestine in particular, they tried to renew and promote the cooperation with the United States. Many American officials and officers welcomed this British intention. As part of this attempt, the Labour government reaffirmed its position concerning the cantonization of Palestine and the creation of two autonomous entities in that country. This was the general background for the British initiative to appoint the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry, which was established in December 1945. Despite the American growing interest in Middle Eastern affairs and in Palestine question, the British position, particularly the decision to retreat from Egypt, was that it should not give up its presence in Palestine and maintain a large number of troops there. The numbers were huge, the numbers of British soldiers here. The tension with the Americans increased as a result of Truman's electoral needs, his former, not pro-Zionist, but pro-Jewish positions, and his promotion of various demands on their behalf, especially concerning the 100,000 Jewish refugees, were at the background. On the other hand, in reaction to the United States demands, the British declared that they would not proceed with the implementing of any of the Anglo-American Committee's recommendation until the Jews and Arabs would stop their aggressive, warlike activities and fighting. At the same time, in view of the impasse concerning the clashes and terrorism in Palestine, some in the British political system and bureaucracy began to think about the evacuation of that troubled country. Because of his uncertain position prior to the expected elections in November 1946, Truman too was under internal pressures to support the partition of Palestine and the establishment of a Jewish state there. Truman announced his support for such partition in what is known as the Yom Kippur Statement on October 4th, 1946. In order to push the United States to reach an agreement with them and avoid the situation in which the United States would win the control over developments in Palestine, which the Americans were far from being enthusiastic about, the British senior politicians began to contemplate and even warn the United States that it would submit the entire dealing with the Palestine question to the United Nations without any preconditions. This meant that the United States would have to undertake the full responsibility, especially in view of clear signs of a growing Soviet Union involvement in the region, as once again, as you mentioned before. Because of Britain's need to have American economic and political support, the main purpose of this idea was to change the American position and to encourage Anglo-American cooperation that would lead to a binational solution in Palestine. Bevin even met Truman to persuade him to change his position in this respect, but to no avail. When all British attempts to persuade the Jews and the Arabs to accept renewed plan for the establishment of a binational state in Palestine that were made in the second round of the London Conference in February 1947, and in view of the debate concerning the future of the British rule of India, the deterioration of the British position in the Middle East, and Britain's bad economic situation, Bevin indeed declared the transfer of responsibility for the continued rule in Palestine and a solution for the Palestine problem to the United Nations. In view of Bevin's declaration, in May 1947, the United Nations decided to appoint the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, UNSCOP. The committee majority's main recommendation was to partition Palestine and to establish a Jewish state there. This led to the United Nations General Assembly November 29, 1947 decision in favor of partition. In view of the British decision to evacuate India, which meant that Palestine was no more crucial for the protection of the Suez Canal, the British government decided to withdraw from Palestine, especially since in the meantime it had become also an economic and military heavy burden on the British. The British decision was communicated to the United States, a step that made it irrevocable. The British government immediately set the date for the end of the mandate and the transfer of power there. The date was May 15, 1948, and this led to the establishment of the State of Israel on that same day. Finally, the following is a short assessment of Truman's role in the major changes in United States policy and their impact on the British government led by Attlee and Bevin. Let me begin by saying that it is very difficult to speculate about Roosevelt's position and policy vis-à-vis Palestine in case he wouldn't have died in April 1945. Despite the changes in the Middle East in general and in Palestine in particular, and the United States' greater involvement in that region, Roosevelt was inclined to cooperate and coordinate the American strategic and tactical policies with the British. Generally speaking, Truman was less inclined to do so. Thus, Truman's basic position concerning the immigration of the 100,000 Jewish refugees in Palestine had tremendous impacts, I think, on the British position and their moves. These positions led the British to giving up the mandate and involving the United Nations and the United States in the development in Palestine. In any case, and as I've mentioned above, these positions and actions led to the establishment of the State of Israel. Thank you very much.
Gabi, double thank for your paper and for being right on time. Our next speaker, Professor Avraham Sela, please.
I'm very pleased to add something about the Middle Eastern actors, and I'll focus on the Arab states and the Palestinians. The literature has been focusing for years on Zionist, British, to some extent American diplomacy, but Arab diplomacy during the crucial years of 1945 to 1948 has remained largely uncovered or unresearched. And there is an ample body of literature that can serve this purpose based on British, American, Zionist archives, as well as, I would say, a significant body of literature, Arabic literature, mainly memoirs, diaries, and also to some extent documents. Let me start with a question, or with a number of questions. We are talking here about 6 Arab states that, as of 1945, became members of the United Nations. As of 1945, 7 Arab states, these 6, including Transjordan, became a group gathered within a regional organization called the Arab League, or the League of Arab States, which more or less acted collectively in order to save Palestine and preserve its Arab nature. They were closely connected with Britain, most of them. 3 of them were connected to Britain with treaties, which actually forced them to be dependent on Britain's arms supplies and gave Britain certain rights at a time of war. Oil started to be produced in the Middle East at the beginning of the century. But specifically, with regard to the United States, as of the mid-30s, United States or American companies became increasingly involved in oil production, first in Kuwait and then in Saudi Arabia. In 1947-48, there were talks between Syrians, Lebanese, and the top-line managerial officers about paving a line that would lead the oil from the Arab Peninsula to the Mediterranean. How can one understand the poor performance of these states, beginning with the inability to conduct a realistic policy that would save most, if not all, of their interests in Palestine? How can one explain their inability to use their advantages with regard to oil, for example? And finally, when one looks at the attitudes and the policies with regard to the recommendations of numerous investigation or inquiry commissions, the last one was the United States Special Committee, UNSCO. When one looks at the development of these attitudes, you find a tremendous rigidity. Was it unrealism? Was it lack of any understanding of the situation that was resulted by the Second World War? My main argument here is that we are talking about weak states which in those particular years were increasingly under attack of their own societies. The paradigm of state-society relations is not well addressed by historians, but it is a great explanation for this specific case, because the societies, especially in Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, where large urban societies existed, in those years were very vibrant with a lively press, political movements, and most of all, extreme ideologies that swept the young generation, which was a new product of modernization and westernization, the new product of the urbanization that was increasingly characterizing these societies from the beginning of the century. It is amazing to see how Arab politicians were so afraid, were so intimidated by every manifestation of demonstrations, riots of small groups of people. The Iraqi government decides to enter Palestine because of a small demonstration by the faculty students at the Baghdad University. Of course, there were much heavier reasons for that, but the weakness of institutions, the weakness of governments is so salient that one should ask the question, why? Well, these were very newly established states. Many of their elites counted on Britain's support, especially the Hashemites. They lacked support and legitimacy by their own constituencies. And it was here where Palestine, during the 3 decades that preceded the war of 1948, created the single most important source of legitimacy for these elites. Palestine represented central core values that related both to Islam and Arabism. And more than that, Palestine resembled everything that they were expecting and wishing for in terms of liberation from colonialism. Zionism was easily identified as part of European colonialism. More than that, colonial imperialism, as they called it. And so, increasingly, during the 20s and 30s, you would see a growing identification of the public in the neighboring countries with the issue of Palestine. This was not a one-way process, because Palestinian leadership, especially Haj Amin al-Husseini, made it one of his main objectives to involve the neighboring countries in this problem, whether by raising funds or by making them responsible for not losing Palestine because of its symbolic values. And he reached out to Indonesia and to Central Asia in his efforts to make the Muslim world, and of course the Arab world, part of that responsibility. So by the time the issue of Palestine comes back to center stage at the end of the Second World War, these governments are fully committed. And it was clearly stated in the charter of the Arab League. The only state not independent yet mentioned in the Arab League charter is Palestine. And this commitment becomes increasingly enforcing in the sense that once the recommendations of the Anglo-American Committee are published, and then, of course, with the partition decision, these governments find themselves forced by their own constituencies to undertake not just commitments but also threats, lest these recommendations be implemented. So the process went from the public to the official, from involvement through statements, through petitions, through diplomatic activities, to official, first involvement, then commitment, then intervention. And it's not that among Arabs there were no figures who looked at the situation realistically and tried to even accommodate the Zionist claims. Most salient among them was, of course, King Abdullah, who was willing to accept partition. Tacitly, not openly, of course. Prime Minister of Egypt, Ismail Sidqi, within a very short time, in 1946, was even willing to consider this. But none of these goodwills survived the rage, the bitterness, the sense of humiliation, and the growing revolutionary mood among the youth, especially students, and the mob. Politics was a matter of the streets. It was not conducted within parliaments, even though parliaments did exist. Societies were markedly immobile, and the only way to affect policies was out of the institutions, out of parliament, in the streets. And if you look at, for example, the daily life in Egypt, in Iraq, in Syria, in the years 1946-47, and I quantified these events, it was tremendously frequent to see demonstrations and riots and violent activities of all kinds of groups, Islamists, Arab nationalists, communists, trade unions, and name it. In addition to all this, there was, of course, the competition among Arab leaders for regional leadership, for regional Arab unity. And Palestine, again, became a weapon in this struggle. But here there was a double game of the Arab leaderships. On the one hand, they all paid lip service to the Palestinian cause, but practically speaking, they had to heed to their own limitations and their own practical constraints. All along, one can see that the Arab point of view hardly changes. Two small episodes that deserve to be mentioned. The first one, during the London conference of late 1946, the Arab delegations, without the Palestinian being represented among them, are willing to offer for the Jewish community in Palestine a status of a religious community, and to accept all Jews living in the country to stay there. For the Arab Higher Committee, this was unacceptable. And in the second round of the London conference in February 1947, this was removed from the agenda. So all those recommendations and ideas, whether raised by Britain or by the UN recommendations, from partition to binationalism, and definitely the idea of bringing into Palestine 100,000 DPs, displaced persons from Europe, this was entirely unacceptable. And even those who were willing to consider these suggestions, one way or another, as I said before, could not stand the public opinion and public rage, and hence rejected any discussion of these issues. The most important issue in those days for the Arab states was not Palestine. It was national liberation. In Egypt, in Iraq, in other countries. The ideal was, like Syria and Lebanon, where France was ousted from these countries without having any rights, any position that would infringe on the status of independence of these countries. And these states had no experience in international relations. Compared to the Zionist movement, with its highly developed skills of diplomacy, with its, I don't know if I should say wise or a fortunate decision to shift its center of gravity from Western Europe to the United States already during the war, the Arabs were in no position to match these skills, contacts, agencies within the United States or North America in general. In 1945, they decided, the Arab League, to establish some information offices in Washington and London in order to improve the Arab attitude in those countries. But the limited resources, the marginal position of these offices, led, by the way, by Musa Alami, the Palestinian prominent leader, more than they say something about the willingness to do something, they actually reflect the weakness and the marginal significance for the Arab leaderships of the Palestinian issue when it came to practicalities. Now, what were the perceptions of these politicians and leaders and elites and kings and so on? Alan Bullock once wrote, the biographer of Ernest Bevin, that the Arab and Zionist positions were expected. They were well known. The one thing that was entirely unexpected was Truman's personal intervention in the process from 1945 on. And the Arabs could not be cleverer than Britain. The Arabs could not do more than the British government could do. Not only they were dependent on Britain, they had no way to understand the major changes in the world balance of power, the new division between the Western and the Eastern blocs, and that actually, by the late 40s, there were clear evidence of the declining power of Britain itself. So this is why they couldn't take advantage even of, for example, the retreat of the American administration in March 1948 from the partition decision. They hardly managed to make a decision about the possibility of using oil as a weapon. And the story is really amazing because it both reflects the fragmentation of this group of states and their inability to show firmness in front of the great powers, namely especially Britain and the United States. In June 1946, shortly after the publication of the recommendation of the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry, they made secret decisions that in case these recommendations would be implemented, they would consider the use of oil in a way that might be detrimental to the interests of these two superpowers, or these two powers. But they kept the decisions secret because they were not able to stand behind them. They could not lose the revenues of oil because they were dependent on them. The only reason, actually, why these decisions were made was because of the rivalry between the Hashemite dynasty, more specifically Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. The Iraqis wanted to embarrass King Ibn Saud by this decision, but they themselves did not have any intention of using their oil against Britain. Another opportunity that they had was the international, mainly American, which to some extent was supported by Britain, suggestions about armistice or truce in Palestine in the last months of the mandate. In March, for example, at the peak of Arab successes against Jewish transportation in the country, Jamal al-Husseini, the Palestinian leader, and at that time primary delegate in the United States, in the United Nations, rejects these ideas as unnecessary because we are doing so well and we will kick the Jews out of the country. Last thing that I want to add here, and it's not an episode, it's a very important issue that hasn't been said so far by the literature. And again, Truman is personally involved in this. The picture that I have been trying to describe here of weakness, of inability to settle domestic pressures with international pressures, with their own interests, led the Arab governments eventually, after the failures of the voluntary forces that entered into Palestine under their own supervision and support, to decide on intervention by their own regular armies, namely official intervention in an area which, according to the United Nations decisions, was still supposed to be partitioned into two states. They knew they had no chance of defeating the Jewish community in Palestine because the chiefs of staff told them that based on simple calculation of the balance of power. Whether they were right or not, that's not the case. The case is that the politicians could not have any better appraisal. They intervened because of domestic pressure in order to save their own thrones and their own positions. And they made the calculation that shortly after the invasion, the international community would intervene and stop them. And then they would start some negotiation in which they would try to get the best. The big surprise came when Truman, shortly or immediately after the declaration of the state, recognized it de facto and turned Israel into a recognized entity on an international level, which really caught the Arab governments in a tremendous dilemma. From now on, they were considered violating not only the UN decision about partition, but also the sovereign rights of the State of Israel, at least from the viewpoint of the American government and shortly afterwards of the Soviet Union. From now on, the behavior of the Arab states in the war would be largely dictated by these constraints, which would eventually lead to their defeat. The last point that I wanted to mention here, and I don't have time, I know, is the issue of the embargo, which, because of their dependence, the Egyptian, Jordanian, and Iraqi dependence on arms supplies by Britain, could not express itself as an advantage for these countries because of the embargo applied on the 29th of May by Britain with the support of the United States. But it was here where Zionists developed system of contacts, of delegates, of people who could give and take in both Eastern as well as Western countries, proved itself as giving a tremendous advantage to the Jewish side over the Arab side. When I came back from the Public Record Office, and I'm going to end with this, I was asked by one of my mentors at that time, Professor Gabi Cohen, so what's the most important thing that you found? And I said, I think we have to plant a tree in the, we call it Yar HaKadoshim, the forest of the judicious or the righteous, for Bevin, for keeping the embargo in such a strict way that you can see it all along the war, in the shortage, in the inability of the Arab armies to act as armies because of that shortage and that embargo. Thank you.
So I think for journalists, you have a headline, at least one headline, the Avram Seller recommendation to do that. Last but not least, Alon Kaddish, please.
About half a year ago, when I was approached to give a lecture, I gave the title, which is advertised in the program. Strangely enough, things have happened during those 6 months, and when I sat down to actually write the lecture, I decided to, instead of a survey, to concentrate on a case study of the general subject advertised. And the case study I will address will be the trusteeship and the Yeshuv's military strategy. Austin, the U.S. representative to the United Nations Security Council, reporting on the 19th of March 1948 on consultations between permanent members of the Council, concluded that since partition could not at present be peacefully implemented, the United States suggested a temporary trusteeship for Palestine under the responsibility of the Trusteeship Council of the United Nations, which presumably would govern the country on behalf of the United Nations. The trusteeship would continue until such time as conditions for the peaceful implementation of partition were established. The creation of such a trusteeship would first have to be adopted by the Security Council as a recommendation to the General Assembly, which in turn would have to be convened for a special session. Austin suggested that the Security Council instruct the Palestine Commission, quote, to suspend its efforts to implement the proposed partition plan. The new American policy was described by Abba Hillel Silver, one of the Jewish Agency's observers at the Security Council, with Moshe Sheltok, in his response to Austin's statement, as a shocking and amazing reversal. It should be clear to everyone, he argued, that the establishment of a trusteeship by the United Nations in Palestine will not automatically ensure peace in that country, and that force will have to be used to maintain that arrangement, just as it would have been necessary to carry out the partition decision of the United Nations. Contrary to Austin's view, the partition, Silver argued, was not an integral whole. Parts of it, i.e. the establishment of a Jewish state, could be implemented independently. The Jewish leadership was committed to partition. Hence, if the United Nations Palestine Commission is unable to carry out the mandate which were assigned to it by the General Assembly, the Jewish people of Palestine will move forward in the spirit of that resolution and will do everything which is dictated by considerations of natural survival and by considerations of justice and historic rights. David Ben-Gurion heard the news of the American vote of peace on the radio. His public response, a statement to the press issued on the 20th of March, was in a similar vein to Abba Hillel Silver. Ben-Gurion declared that the new American position did not fundamentally change the situation in Palestine and did not undermine the inevitable foundation of a Jewish state. This, practically speaking, would not depend on the UN's decision, but on Jewish ability and will to bring to bear its full military potential. We decide the fate of the country, he said. We lay the foundations of a Jewish state, and we shall erect it. Furthermore, in view of the success of the Jewish armed efforts over the past months in withstanding all Arab attacks on Jewish communities, the Jewish state, he said, exists and will exist if we know how to defend it. Effectively, however, Ben-Gurion saw little that could be done beyond the ongoing preparations for the showdown with the Arabs anticipated once the mandate ended and the British Army left. In a meeting of the secretariat of his party, Mapai, convened on the 20th of March, the same day of his response, to discuss Austin's statement, at least one speaker, Chaim Halperin, suggested going on the offensive. Ben-Gurion answered that the Jewish community should keep to its present course, especially in matters military. The strategy should remain unchanged, i.e. responsive. And I quote, "We shall fight only those who fight us." Ben-Gurion's response reflected a general strategic evaluation adopted by the Yishuv's military and political leadership based on the British stated policy of maintaining full control over the country up until the very end of the mandate, thereby preserving the territorial status quo between Arabs and Jews. Hence, a military decision in the fight against Palestine's Arabs could only be forced after the mandate ended and the British Army withdrew. Until then, the best that could be done was to hold on to existing assets and to build up the military force necessary for the eventual decisive confrontation over the realization of partition. The same evaluation was expressed in the preamble of Plan Dalet, drawn up by the Haganah High Command's Operations Branch and issued in March 1948. The plan dealt with the day after and assumed at the outset that it would be put into operation when the government's forces will not be in the country, or at the most remain in only a few bases and areas. Once the government forces withdrew, the Jewish army would face an invasion of Arab regular armies supported by semi-regular volunteers and local Arab forces. Not only was the crucial date nearly 2 months away, it was widely felt, not least by Yigael Yadin and other senior commanders of the Haganah, that the Jewish forces were not yet ready for war. It was Israel Galili's view that the best Jewish course was to bid their time and avoid confrontations. Nevertheless, a strategic change did occur, due not to a change in Jewish strategic thinking, but to a series of redeployments of the British forces, which enabled both sides to initiate local offensives. These gradually and accumulatively constituted a strategic change whereby the Jews had effectively beaten the Palestinian Arabs by the time the mandate had ended and before the regular Arab armies could invade Palestine. From the outset of the hostilities, following the UN's adoption of the partition resolution, the British Army found itself in an increasingly difficult situation. The Army had been in the process of continuous contraction, with units being amalgamated or shut down altogether. As the intercommunal violence escalated in Palestine, fewer and fewer troops were available to deal with an increasing number of potentially life-threatening situations. The initial official policy of maintaining law and order throughout the country was gradually abandoned in favor of minimizing the risk to British troops. The task of securing lines of communication and designated routes of the eventual evacuation took precedence over maintaining law and order and preserving the status quo between Arabs and Jews. The change was first felt in the south. On 20th February, the 61st Laureate Infantry Brigade, previously in charge of the south of the country, i.e. the northern Negev, was withdrawn from Palestine. It was replaced by a task force called South Force, which consisted of a single infantry battalion, 2nd King's Royal Rifle Corps, reinforced by a troop of armored cars of the Life Guards, a battery of self-propelled anti-tank guns, and a few auxiliary units. At the time, one of the Army's tasks was to secure the passage of 8 weekly Jewish convoys. Arab roadblocks in the village of Brer and the policy of avoiding, wherever possible, direct confrontations with either side, led the British Army to concentrate its efforts on securing only the coastal road, deploying along it 5 daily patrols, thereby allowing Jews and Arabs to operate freely throughout the rest of the Negev. This allowed the Jews to found the settlement of Brur Chayil on the 18th, 19th of April, opposite the Arab village of Brer, in an attempt to secure the passage of Jewish convoys east of the Arab village, and eventually to occupy a number of Arab villages before mid-May. The fact that the Army followed an internally evolving policy, largely dictated by its own concerns and priorities, rather than by a commonly suspected conspiracy to help one side against the other, proved a source of considerable confusion. Thus, the Army's redeployment along the main Jerusalem-Latrun highway came as a surprise to the Jewish command, which had often accused the Army of an anti-Jewish bias in its treatments of its Jerusalem convoys. On 23rd February, the Army decided to prohibit the regular use of the main road to Jerusalem, which had previously been designated as an evacuation route, and therefore kept open to all traffic throughout the day. At night there was a curfew, that wasn't a problem. Previously, the British forces along the road were responsible for removing Arab roadblocks and extracting Jewish convoys held up by Arab ambushes. In other words, if Arab ambushes shot up Jewish convoys, that was all right. But if the convoys stopped and were blocked, then the roadblocks had to be removed, and occasionally this meant British firing on Arab irregulars. In addition, a military presence along the road was necessary to ensure the operation of the pumps along the water pipe to Jerusalem, and maintenance work on the communication cables under the road, which had become the main telephone link of the government in Jerusalem with the rest of the country. However, an increasing rate of losses sustained by the Army, the result of a steady improvement in the Arab military effectiveness, and consequent confidence, resulted in a decision to switch all road traffic beyond the bare minimum to the Beit Ur, Beit Horon, road, which ran through a homogeneous Arab-controlled area and therefore was not contested. As a result, the Arab forces along the road were able to intensify their attacks on Jewish convoys, with the result that by the end of March, the convoy system came to a halt. Hence, it was the army's decision to switch roads in order to reduce the threat to its soldiers from Arab attacks that forced the Jewish forces onto the offensive in order to open the road to Jerusalem, starting with the Nachshon operation, 3rd to 15th of April. By the 15th of May, the Haganah occupied the ridges and the Arab villages along the road between Bab el-Wad and Jerusalem, thereby defeating the main Palestinian military force, the Eastern Brigade of the Holy Jihad, whose commander, Abdul Qadir al-Husseini, was killed in the fighting. For similar reasons, and after repeated attempts to secure a local ceasefire, which would stabilize the situation until the final evacuation on the 15th of May, the army decided to withdraw from the mixed town at Tzfat, in which the Arabs enjoyed a clear demographic superiority. The army's commanders feared that a withdrawal from Tzfat would result in a massacre of its Jewish population. It offered to evacuate at least the civilian population under its protection, but the leaders of the Jewish community refused, and on the 16th of April, the army withdrew its sole undermanned company of Irish Guards from the town. However, contrary to expectations, the Jewish forces in Tzfat managed to withstand Arab attacks and on the 10th of May occupied the town, with the result that its Arab population fled north to Lebanon. So I remind you again, 10th of May, Tzfat is occupied, and it's only the 15th of May that the mandate ends. In Tiberias, the Jews enjoyed a clear demographic and topographical advantage. The failure of the army commander in Tiberias to either broker or force a ceasefire led him to allow the Jewish forces to occupy the town. The situation was that he felt that he'd lost control over the town. He called over the commanders of the Haganah and said, "What do I do to get some quiet around here?" And they said, "The fight between us and the Arabs is none of your concern." And he said, "Well, what do we do anyway?" And they said, "Well, give us three days and we'll sort it out." And the British army stood aside for 3 days and allowed the Jews to occupy Tiberias. The strange thing about it is after they arranged a safe passage for the Arab population, they stayed on in Tiberias for 10 more days, because that was according to the timetable of withdrawal, under Jewish rule. So the British army stayed within its camp and the police station and allowed the Jews to govern Tiberias. The army's decision to redeploy in the eastern Galilee culminated in its decision to withdraw its troops from most of the city of Haifa, leaving in its control a strip which included the port from which the final evacuation of British troops in the north took place. As a result, the Jews occupied Haifa on the 22nd of April, and the majority of the Arab population fled by sea and by land with British armed protection. While allowing the two sides to fight it out amongst themselves as much as a month before the end of the mandate, the British army did not tolerate any action likely to endanger its lines of communication and its planned evacuation routes. In the Negev, an armored patrol shelled Kibbutz Miftachim after Jewish armored cars attacked an Arab truck alongside an army roadblock on the coastal road near Rafiah. In Jerusalem, a faulty evaluation of British policy led Jewish troops to occupy the Arab neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, through which ran the main road from Jerusalem north and then west to Beit Ur and Latrun. The Jewish forces, having been warned repeatedly, were attacked and ejected from Sheikh Jarrah with the promise that when the mandate ended, the neighborhood would be turned over to the Haganah. Similarly, a stern army warning prevented the Jews from following up their victory in Katamon in southern Jerusalem and occupy all South Jerusalem, thereby threatening the southern evacuation route through Bethlehem and Hebron. Now, this is a source of some confusion on the Jewish side, because on the one hand, they allowed them to occupy Tiberias, occupy Haifa, and on the other hand, did not allow them to occupy parts of Jerusalem while ignoring other parts. So they ejected the Jews from Sheikh Jarrah, but allowed them to occupy Katamon. What they didn't realize was that the British actually meant what they said. To conclude, the change in U.S. policy did not of itself change Jewish strategy, although it probably sharpened the sense of urgency with which the Yishuv prepared to face the ultimate military confrontation with the Arabs once the mandate ended. Similarly, it may well have encouraged Arab leaders to believe that partition could still be prevented. But it was due to a series of unilateral British Army decisions to redeploy its forces with the purpose of reducing friction with the warring communities in a way which would not compromise the final withdrawal at the end of the mandate, that resulted in the intensification of the war between the Jews and the Arabs. While the escalation was not generally of Jewish making, it both enabled and forced the Jewish forces to take the initiative, with the result that by the time the army withdrew from most of the country in mid-May, the Jewish partition state was a territorial reality, and the Palestinian Arabs largely defeated. The Yishuv had realized a partition by its own military efforts earlier than it itself had anticipated. It was now faced with the daunting task of defending it against the invading regular Arab armies. That's it.
Okay, thank you very much, Alon. We are opening up the session for questions. If you have any comments, please make it short. Could I ask anyone who's just raising his hand to present itself and I'm giving him the right? Please, Michael Cohen. Okay, just please.
To Professor Zuboff, it's long been understood that the Soviets were out to get the British out of the Middle East. And that was one of the reasons they supported the Zionists. I've never heard an explanation. Did they not fear losing influence in 6 Arab states with the military assets and the oil, which the West was so afraid of losing access to? And by definition, the Soviets also knew of these assets. Did they not fear
Okay.
the enmity of the Arabs?
Okay, please.
That's related to that question, Stephanie Hoffman. I wanted to ask you, presented on the one side the advantages of ideology toward favoring Israel. I wonder how much, as opposed to the economic considerations of oil, was there evidence, and was it at all a factor of Soviet attitude toward the Arabs at the time as a kind of distrust or dislike as too much under the influence of the imperialists and not a likely ally with the Soviets?
Okay. Yes, please. Yes, you.
Brad Isaacs. This is addressed to Professor Kedish. Is there any suggestion that the British permissions to occupy Tiberias and Haifa, not permissions but actions that permitted it, and the continuation of the embargo were part of a considered plan? Did anyone actually talk about it and say, well, this is a good thing, and not allow them to occupy Jerusalem for the same reason?
Yes. Please, Gidon.
To Professor Sela, you know that I would be the last to dismiss a revisionist theory just because it contradicts conventional wisdom, but I want to make sure I understand yours about the arms embargo. You hold that it was so even-handedly enforced against both the Jewish and the Arab side that it even permitted the Jewish side, thanks to the Soviet arms supply via Czechoslovakia, to overcome the advantage that the Arabs had due to the fact that they already had standing armies, which the Jews did not. And just to Professor Kadish, I think you're referring to Sheikh Badr, not Sheikh Jarrah.
Sheikh Jarrah.
Sheikh Jarrah was occupied.
Yes, sure.
We are all learning, you know. Yes. Any other?
Yeah.
Yes. In a minute. Okay.
Professor Zuboff, could you put in context the impact of the Jewish demonstration in Achipa streets receiving Golda Meirson, and did that influence Stalin, or is that a myth?
Okay. Anyone here? Yes, please.
Rabbi Dr. Shmuel Povlen, originally from Jerusalem, currently from Sydney, Australia. I would like to refer to Professor Sela with all this description. I wonder if he was still in this world during 1948, because I've been here, I was here as a 13 years old, and we felt, all of us, that the Arabs of Palestine was easily for them to convince the Arab countries to invade because they had regular army with planes and tanks, and was a piece of cake for them to take Palestine. And I would say that if after the victory of the Jews here, and they saw the hand of God from it, if they changed Zionism to religious Zionism, and later on in subsequent war, we would not have the problems today as we have today. Because we believe that God, the hand of God, is behind us to release all the land that God had promised us.
Thank you very much. That's a seminar, not a question. Okay, any other questions? So if not, yes, please.
The benevolent land from Truman. Avram Sela. You posed the question very validly. How come the 6 or 7 Arab states failed to be effective to realize their assets?
Militarily?
Pardon?
Militarily?
No, altogether, politically and so on. You posed the question, and you provided a whole series of very convincing reasons. But I wonder whether you, reasons which were both regional and extra-regional, but I wonder whether you didn't give enough attention to a local reason, and that is the total effectiveness of the Palestinian Arab community itself, its lack of institutions, its incoherence, its lack of unified leadership. And was that not yet an additional and very relevant reason to the failure of Arab states to march?
If there are no questions, I take the liberty of posing a question to each of you. To Professor Zubok, you spoke about the Soviet support, the political support, the military support, and I wonder whether the new documents say something about issue which really which really preoccupied Israel, even at the height of the 48 or our War of Independence, and that's the issue of immigration from Eastern Europe, especially from Eastern Europe. Any new material, any new revelation to a topic which really colored much of our relation with the Soviet Union after 48. To Professor Gabi Schäfer, you spoke about the cooperation on the one hand and the conflict on the other between the United States and Britain concerning the solution to the problem of Palestine at the time. Could I press you to say something about what you think about when did it stop to be a British game or Anglo-British game and started to be an American game, diplomatically speaking or politically speaking? Just point your finger and explain. That's interesting, I mean, to learn from you. To Avraham Sela, what was novel to me or really intrigued me were your comments about the Arab military authority assessment of where the war is heading in the pre-May 48 period, which means that the experts on the Arab side were rather pessimistic. They, in effect, joined hand with our experts, which were equally pessimistic, and that's the question that I shall shortly address to Alon Kadish. Could you enlarge on that? I mean, the experts, the Arab experts, what did they know? How did they assess the situation? Because we have been witnessing a flourishing literature about the overall balance of power between Israel or the fledgling state of Israel and the Arab side. And in contrast to the conventional wisdom, what has emerged from the literature is that Israel was really Samson or Goliath, not David, in terms of politics, in terms of diplomacy, in terms of military power, and it was not sheer coincidence that the 48 war ended in the favor of the Jews. So could you say something about the experts? And the last question to Alon Kaddish relates to the same topic. On 12 May 1948, when Israel was waging the decision whether to declare independence, the two leading experts, military experts, Yadin and Galili, told the Minhalet Ha'am on 12th of May that they are not sure about the result of war. It's a 50-50 kind of a gamble, the end result of the war. Could you say something about, and you mentioned that they were pessimistic in early 48, so do the new documents shed some light about their position from, let's say, early 48 to May 48 to tell a whole story? So if there are no questions, Professor Zubok, please.
Great questions, and they allow me to raise some points that I did not in my talk. Too little time. I think it was most important that the published Soviet diplomatic documents show us that Soviet diplomats of all ranks, middle ranks and higher ranks, saw the dangers of allying too closely with the Jews, and they pointed repeatedly to the dangers of losing Arab support, moreover undercutting Arab communists, and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, consistently in the documents for the second half of 47 and 48, you find bias towards the Jews to such an extent that whatever Arabs committed were mentioned as atrocities, bloody acts perpetrated. Whatever the Jews did during the war, a milder language was used. I immediately suspected maybe those who wrote those documents had sort of tribal sympathy, but none of those, the authors of those documents, were actually Russian Soviet Jews. They were all ethnic Russians. So there must be some, logical missing links, and that, of course, is Stalin and what was on his mind, and we still don't know it. A couple of hypotheses that, one of which I already suggested, but I see clearly that two missing links are Stalin's experience in the Middle East preceding this case, and the most interesting and well-documented case is Stalin's attempt to gain sphere of influence in northern Iran. And we still don't quite understand the lessons that he drew from that experience, but he must have drawn some lessons that kind of let him extrapolate maybe that what happened to him in Iran, that is, the Iranian regime allied with Britain and the United States at the last moment, the same would definitely happen to the Arab regimes. They're way too dependent on the British, and also given remarkable access of Stalin's spies in Great Britain at that time, it was a big surprise that he knew pretty well that it was the British expectation as well. Second, hypothesis that you cannot underestimate the military factor. Stalin was the commander-in-chief during the Second World War that just ended a few years ago. How he could expect the Jews, 640,000 Jews, without a regular army, to defeat 7 Arab states with regular armies backed by the British. It defies imagination how he could have expected that. And given that, his option clearly was to help the weaker side, not the stronger side, to keep some kind of an open-ended balance in the region, to continue that crisis, and that would allow him to catch some fish in troubled waters. It's of course only a hypothesis, but I think that should be explored. On Golda Meir, Meir Son, and domestic impact, it was enormous. It was not a myth. It was a huge and actually nasty surprise to the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. According to the documents published in Russia, they were scared to death by avalanche of letters from Jews living in the Soviet Union offering to support Israel, to go and fight there for their tribesmen, for people of their blood. And that rising wave of Jewish nationalism meant that they shared their identity between the Soviet identity and the Israeli identity, which made all the Jews in the Soviet Union extremely vulnerable. And the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee people understood it, realized that, and actually tried even to suppress those letters. But of course, Stalin knew about it. And the Moscow manifestations around the synagogue were only one signal. There were many, many more. So it was a very, very important factor that, of course, influenced Stalin along with geopolitical calculations. But the last question from Professor Biala on immigration from Eastern Europe. It is. There are some interesting tidbits in the published documents. We still lack the key documents, basically how that immigration was discussed between Stalin and Eastern European leaders, and I'm almost sure it must have been discussed. Actually, I'm 100% sure it couldn't have been allowed without Stalin's consent. All the people, like Anna Pauker and so on and so forth, were later executed, and linked to that immigration and support of Israel. So it's an interesting case. One thing that came out remarkably in Moshe Sharet's conversations is that the confrontation between Israel and Stalin's Soviet Union will come when Israel will raise the issue of immigration of Soviet Jews. And that's exactly what began to happen in 1948, since the crisis in June and then in the fall of 1948, and that gradually convinced Stalin, according to a brilliant study of Yuri Slezkin at least, that Jews in the Soviet Union are an unreliable diaspora that has to be somehow neutralized. Okay.
Thank you. It seems to me that the British realization that the Americans are going to control the Middle East and be involved, very deeply involved in the Palestine issue, was a gradual process. I think that it started pretty early from the point of view of the British government, the Labour government. I think that it was a gradual, as I said, a gradual process, and it's very difficult to point at exactly which, at what time, what exact minute the British realized it and gave it up. And as I said in my presentation, this was not only because of the American greater involvement, especially after Truman's beginning of his role as the President of the United States. It was a growing realization as a result of the entire situation in the Middle East and the entire deterioration of the British Empire. But since Uri Geller is a friend of mine, I'm trying to point at exactly the point in which it became clear to the British and they decided that the United States is. I think it seems to me that it was connected to the British initiative to appoint the Anglo-American Committee late in 1945. This was a realization and recognition of the role of the United States in the Palestinian issue.
There were a number of questions addressed to me, but there was one issue that I want to add to the question about Soviet Arab perceptions and policies. I don't know if the Soviets thought or didn't think about what they might lose in the Arab world. I can only say that from the Arab viewpoint, it seemed that there was nothing more threatening and more frightening to the Arab ruling elites than communism and Soviet encroachment on the Middle East.
And just to give you one small example, when the war started on the 15th of May, the first thing Arab governments did was to apply emergency law, which allowed them, and this was the intention, to suppress communists and other radicals. And surely enough, immediately when the war starts, they begin with campaigns of arrests and repression of these movements. And so from the Arab viewpoint, it didn't look like even a remote possibility that they would think of approaching the Soviet Union, because this was against their aristocratic, very, very conservative viewpoint. And I won't go any longer into it. About the embargo, look, according to the defense treaties between Britain and Egypt, Iraq, and Transjordan, they could not approach any other government for arms supplies. In mid-1948, during the first truce in Palestine, the Egyptians went to the Belgian and asked from Fabrique Nationale to provide them with some weapons. Bevin writes a letter to Spock and says, as you know, we have a defense treaty with Egypt, and no one should provide them with weapons other than us. So he asks him not to do anything about it, and he didn't. In the Public Record Office, there is a file this thick about a correspondence, endless correspondence, about a request of a sport club in Cairo about the supply of 10,000 bullets, 0.22, which comes up to Bevin, and Bevin says no, eventually. And it comes down again and up again, and it goes nowhere. The problem with the embargo is that while Arabs suffered from it due to those commitments and their poor abilities to replace the sources of armed procurement, Jews were in a much better position. They had an independent state, and as of especially the first truce, they managed to bring lots of weapons that had been bought even earlier and could only be shipped once the Jews had their own independent harbor. And of course, airports and so on and so forth. About the hand of God, I am entirely.
You must answer this one.
Speechless.
No, I believe you. I mean, if you don't want to,
No. Listen. We are academics.
It's a miracle.
No. If you want to believe in miracles, that's fine with me. But methodologically speaking, if you can prove or validate a phenomenon without resorting to mysterious, mystic reasons, then we can say that maybe there was the hand of God. But there was definitely very good reasons that we can quantify, that we can pinpoint to explain that the results of that war. And I argue, and Alon Kadish is here, who deals a lot with the military aspects of the war, and many others, who can easily explain it without the need to think about a divine cause. But I respect it, and I have nothing against it.
I'm able to explain to you.
About to Neville's question, of course, the weakness of the Palestinian community in terms of institutions, in terms of organization, and so on, was a major element. But I didn't go into this because of simply a lack of time. But on the whole, we are talking here about very weak states, very weak institutions in terms of mobilization capabilities, especially compared to the Jewish community in Palestine, with all the deficiencies and with all the defection and problems with mobilizing the full force that the Jewish community could provide, still it was much, much higher than what was going on in the Arab countries. And in addition, there were problems in these countries, problems of stability, domestic stability, and for example, take the case of the Kurdish rebellion in Iraq. It needed a certain amount of forces to be grounded in northern Iraq, which could not be sent to Palestine. Or in Egypt, for example, in April 1948, the army was called to suppress a police strike, which took the government by surprise, and they didn't know how to deal with it other than by force. So these problems explain something about the weakness or the inability to go for this war with their full capabilities. The last question about the estimate of forces by the Arabs. At least in the case of the Arabs, they had an experience. They had seen the number of months of fighting between volunteers or semi-regular volunteer units and the Jewish community, and they first of all came to the conclusion that actually, since no attack on any Jewish settlement managed to capture a settlement, and there were a number of attacks on kibbutzim and other settlements, and secondly, because of the concentrated ability of the Jewish leadership and command. And this was one point that they stressed very clearly when they mentioned how much force, what would be the order of battle necessary to defeat the Jewish community. They made it very clear that it had to be under one unified command. And this was a major, major problem all along the war, because they had a commander just by definition, King Abdullah, but in fact he had no authority on the Arab forces.
Thank you, Allah.
Two questions basically. One, was there a plan for the troop behavior in Tiberias, Haifa, Jerusalem? There wasn't. The developments came from the bottom upwards and were made possible by a very curious alliance between Montgomery, who was SIG's Chief Imperial General Staff, and his minister, Manny Shinwell, was Minister of War, both of them against Bevin. Montgomery's tendency was to allow the commanders on the ground freedom to decide their own policy if they were not given sufficient means by the government. Shinwell was happy to support him because he had it in for Bevin and some other colleagues in the cabinet who ousted him after the energy crisis the year before. So the development was a local development, but it was okayed by the higher authorities. And there's very interesting exchanges in Parliament on that issue, but that's more or less my reconstruction. And it can be documented from regimental sources, the way in which the decision was reached in the north. And the problem is that the perspective, the geographical perspective, is a northern perspective in this case, and not one city, one town, each town separately. This is a command, a northern command. Stockwell is commander of the northern district, and all these decisions are coordinated. So it's part of one policy, but it's a policy which was decided on days before the actual actions. As for the question of worst case scenario compared to the Shuvas Goliath, when it comes to the worst case scenario, i.e. the 50-50 evaluation, that's based on the worst case scenario which never happened. In other words, the anticipation was that the Arab armies would invade more or less on the lines of the Plan Dalet. And that never happened. As Avram mentioned, the command was not a unified command, despite appearances. Each invading army served its own country's purposes, so the attack was not coordinated except for the actual date. The Lebanese never attacked, the Syrians attacked from a disadvantaged position, whereas the initial plan was to invade elsewhere, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, the question of the Yeshuvas Goliath, I don't think that's a very serious argument, especially if you consider the disasters that befell the Haganah forces at the beginning of hostilities. Starting with the various convoys, Bet Shemen, Lamed Hey, Nebi Daniel, Yechiam, with scores of casualties. What happened to the Jewish forces is, I think very fortunately, the war was a staged war. In other words, they accumulated experience by the time the Arab armies invaded. Had the British army stuck to the policy of maintaining the status quo until the actual end of the mandate, the situation would have been much worse. But having accumulated considerable military experience, their performance afterwards differs enormously from the performance at the beginning. So there's a very steep learning curve, which has to do with the qualities of the Yishuv and who the commanders were and so on. But there's a vast difference between the performance of the army in December 47 or January 48, and its performance by the end of the war. By that time, it's probably the best army in the Middle East.
Before we adjourn, just a tiny comment. I mentioned the idea of the Yishuv or the fledgling state being a Goliath and not David. I would urge the audience to read a very interesting book by Amitzur Ilan on the impact of the embargo on the overall military ability. And he, another scholar, Chaim Greenberg, and the late Chaim Barkai addressed another topic, which is of high importance to the understanding of the fate of war, and that's the economic element of war. I mean, were we the Rothschild or the others? And the evidence is that we were not that poor. As a matter of fact, during certain stages of war, and I totally agree with Alon, we cannot speak about the war in a unified kind of a term. We have to differentiate. We have to look at certain periods of the war. But overall speaking, at the crucial time of the war, when the issue of money was there, we were approaching the status of Rothschild. Just to give you one piece of evidence, I came across one item of information, and that is that by 1948, we supplied Czechoslovakia something like 25% of its foreign currency earning at the time. And it was done in cash and in gold. So, I mean, the story is there, still there to be told. I think we have learned a lot this session. I would like to thank Vladimir Zubov, Gabriel Schaefer, Ram Sela, Alon Kadish. We are adjourning now. We shall reconvene at 3:30. We all have earned our lunch. Thank you very much.